Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe, where we explore the world's most important historical and international topics in clear and thoughtful English, making complex events accessible for learners everywhere. And today, we are beginning a very important journey together as we open a discussion on the Cold War legacy and how it connects directly with the rise of China in our modern times.
Yes, and this is truly a fascinating subject because the Cold War was not just a distant moment in history that ended in 1991, but it continues to shape the way countries think, behave, and interact with each other even now, especially when we look at how the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada respond to China's growing power on the global stage, making this both a historical and a contemporary subject.
Before we begin, dear listeners, we kindly ask for your support, and if you are enjoying our podcasts and learning something new, please take a moment to like this video because your small click of support means a great deal, and also remember to subscribe to the English Globe so you never miss future episodes where we cover history, politics, and global issues in clear English that helps you learn and grow.
And we would also love to hear from you, so please share your thoughts in the comments section below, because we are curious to know where you are listening from, whether you are studying English in Asia, Europe, Africa, or the Americas. And we also want to know what you think about today's topic, since your ideas and experiences enrich our conversations and create a global classroom of curious learners.
Now let us carefully step into the heart of today's topic, which is the Cold War legacy and how the Western alliance, including the US, UK, and Canada, find themselves dealing with the challenge of China's rise. And this is important not just for historians, but for everyone, because the policies, alliances, and conflicts from the Cold War continue to influence our present world in ways that are not always obvious at first glance.
Exactly, because when we study this subject, we begin to see how past rivalries have shaped the modern balance of power. And for English learners, this is especially valuable since it allows you to practice reading and listening while also gaining cultural and political knowledge, helping you to both improve your language skills and to understand how history connects with the issues that you read about in today's news headlines.
For example, when you read about current debates over technology, trade, military alliances, or global influence, you may notice that many of the patterns were established during the Cold War. And by looking at how the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada acted during that time, you will see why they respond in certain ways to China today, making the connection between past and present very clear and useful for your understanding.
And another reason why this topic is important is because it helps us reflect on the meaning of power itself, since the Cold War was not only about weapons or armies, but also about ideas, culture, and economic models. And as China grows stronger, the Western world must once again think carefully about how to respond. And by studying this, we gain lessons about cooperation, competition, and the need for dialogue between nations.
So, dear listeners, as we continue with this episode, think of it not only as a history lesson, but also as a way to understand the roots of the modern world, because the Cold War may have ended, but its legacy is alive in today's international relations. And by exploring this legacy together, we will better understand why the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada view China's rise with both hope and caution at the same time.
And finally, we encourage you once again to support the English Globe by subscribing, liking, and commenting, because your voice matters, your support keeps us going, and your participation helps create a strong community of learners from around the world. And now that we have introduced today's subject, let us prepare to move deeper into the story and uncover the key events and forces that shaped the Cold War era. When we think about the Cold War, it is important to remember that it was not a traditional war fought directly between the United States and the Soviet Union, but rather a global struggle of influence where the two sides competed in politics, economics, culture, and military alliances, and this competition divided much of the world into two camps, shaping international relations for nearly half a century.
That is correct. And what made the Cold War so unique was that it involved what many called a battle of systems, because the United States and its allies stood for liberal democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union promoted communism and a one-party state, and this ideological division created deep mistrust, so both sides built strategies to defend their values, protect their allies, and prevent the spread of the other's influence.
One of the most famous terms used to describe this division was the phrase Iron Curtain, which was popularized by Winston Churchill in a speech he gave in 1946. And when he spoke of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe, he meant that there was now a clear line separating Western Europe, supported by the United States and Britain, from Eastern Europe, which had fallen under Soviet influence, creating a continent split into two very different political realities.
Yes, and this division quickly became formalized through the creation of alliances, with the United States taking the lead in organizing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949, which was designed to bring together countries like the United Kingdom, Canada, France, and others into a collective security agreement, meaning that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all, giving Western nations a strong defensive position.
On the Soviet side, the response came later with the formation of the Warsaw Pact in 1955, which united Eastern European communist countries under Soviet leadership. And together these two alliances represented not just military agreements, but also political declarations that the world was now divided into two heavily armed camps, both suspicious of each other and both preparing for the possibility of direct conflict, even if they avoided it most of the time.
What is interesting is that Canada, though often seen as a middle power rather than a superpower, played a significant role in NATO and in Cold War diplomacy, because Canada contributed troops, resources, and political support to Western defense, while also promoting peacekeeping missions through the United Nations, showing that even countries without massive armies could still shape international relations through smart diplomacy and balanced engagement.
That is a very good point, and Canada's role highlights how the Cold War was not only about the big players like the United States and the Soviet Union, but also about the medium and smaller powers who had to make careful choices about alliances, trade, and political values. And Canada often tried to act as a bridge between stronger nations, supporting Western unity while also advocating for dialogue and conflict resolution whenever possible.
Another key feature of the Cold War power struggle was the arms race, especially the competition to build nuclear weapons, because once both sides developed atomic bombs and later hydrogen bombs, the world entered a very dangerous period where the concept of mutually assured destruction meant that any nuclear war would destroy both sides, making direct conflict too costly, but still creating constant fear of escalation.
And alongside the arms race, there was also the space race, where both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to prove their technological superiority by launching satellites, sending astronauts and cosmonauts into space, and eventually landing on the moon. And these achievements were not only scientific milestones, but also powerful symbols of which system, capitalist democracy or communist socialism, was more innovative and capable of leading humanity into the future.
Economically, the Cold War also divided the world because the United States and its allies promoted free markets, international trade, and the Marshall Plan, which helped rebuild Western Europe after World War II, while the Soviet Union controlled economies in Eastern Europe through central planning, heavy industry, and resource sharing within the communist bloc. And these two economic systems influenced how countries around the world chose their paths of development.
Politically, both sides also competed for influence in newly independent countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Because as European empires collapsed after World War II, many nations were searching for models of development, and the United States and Soviet Union each offered support, aid, or alliances, hoping to expand their influence globally. And in this way, the Cold War was not limited to Europe, but truly extended across almost every region of the world.
For Western countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, this meant that the Cold War was not just about defending Europe, but also about projecting values and influence worldwide, and NATO often became a platform for coordinating political positions, sharing intelligence, and cooperating on military readiness. So the Western alliance developed habits of cooperation that continue to influence their policies even in today's international environment.
And this long struggle from 1945 to 1991 created many moments of crisis, such as the Berlin blockade, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Vietnam War, each of which tested the resolve of both sides and demonstrated the risks of miscalculation. And yet, through all these challenges, the Cold War remained a conflict that never turned into direct war between the superpowers, which is why it is often described as a cold conflict rather than a hot one.
So when we look back at the Cold War power struggle, we can see that it established the foundations of modern strategic thinking for Western nations, because the lessons of unity, deterrence, alliance building, and careful diplomacy became central to how the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada operated. And these habits still shape their approach today when dealing with new challenges like the rise of China in the 21st century.
Exactly. And for English learners, studying this history is not just about memorizing facts, but also about seeing patterns. Because the strategies that were used during the Cold War help us understand why certain policies are chosen today, and by learning the vocabulary, the events, and the ideas of this period, students can strengthen both their English skills and their awareness of how history continues to influence current global issues.
When we shift our focus to the economic dimensions of the Cold War, we immediately notice that this struggle was not only about weapons, politics, and ideology, but also about two very different visions of how to organize societies, because the capitalist model championed by the United States and its allies emphasized free markets, private ownership, and competition, while the communist model promoted by the Soviet Union emphasized state planning, collective ownership, and central control.
This economic contrast created not just a theoretical debate, but a very real division in how countries developed their industries, agriculture, and trade, and nations often felt pressure to choose between these models, since joining the capitalist camp meant gaining access to Western investment, technology, and markets, while aligning with the communist bloc usually meant adopting centrally planned economies with heavy state involvement, often guided by Moscow's priorities.
A major step that highlighted the Western economic approach was the Marshall Plan, which was launched by the United States in 1948. And through this program, billions of dollars were provided to help rebuild Western Europe after the devastation of World War II, not only restoring infrastructure, housing, and industries, but also strengthening political stability, preventing communist influence from spreading, and showing how economic aid could be used as a powerful tool of diplomacy.
The Marshall Plan had a deep legacy because it demonstrated the effectiveness of open markets combined with financial support, and it helped Western Europe recover much faster than Eastern Europe, which was under Soviet control and excluded from this program. So while West Germany, France, Italy, and other nations experienced rapid economic growth, the Eastern Bloc lagged behind, leading to growing differences in living standards that also influenced public opinion.
Another key aspect of Cold War economics was the way trade was managed, because the United States and its allies promoted free trade and international institutions like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which later became the World Trade Organization, while the Soviet Union established its own system called the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, where trade between communist countries was tightly controlled and often based on political loyalty rather than efficiency.
These competing systems had different effects on industry and technology because capitalist countries encouraged private innovation, entrepreneurship, and competition, leading to rapid advancements in consumer goods, electronics, and automobiles, while communist states focused heavily on military industry, steel production, and large collective projects, which achieved some impressive results in areas like space technology, but often left everyday consumer products of much lower quality compared to the West.
Canada's role in this economic struggle is also worth mentioning, because while Canada was not a superpower, it was a vital contributor to Western trade networks, resource supply, and industrial cooperation, and its economy became deeply tied to both the United States and Europe, helping to stabilize Western markets and providing an example of how a middle power could thrive under the capitalist model, while also supporting global development and peacekeeping efforts.
Another interesting feature of Cold War economics was how it influenced the global South, because many newly independent countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America received offers of aid, loans, and trade agreements from both the capitalist and communist sides. And while some countries leaned toward the Soviet Union for infrastructure and military support, many others welcomed Western investment, creating a global competition for influence that was as much about money as it was about ideology.
The arms race itself also had enormous economic consequences, because both the United States and the Soviet Union poured vast amounts of money into developing nuclear weapons, advanced aircraft, and missiles. And while this created jobs and technological breakthroughs, it also placed heavy burdens on government budgets. And in the case of the Soviet Union, these costs contributed to economic stagnation and eventual collapse, showing how unsustainable extreme military spending can become.
Meanwhile, Western nations benefited from what was sometimes called the consumer revolution, because as economies recovered and expanded, citizens in countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada enjoyed higher standards of living, more access to household goods, cars, televisions, and new technologies. And this visible prosperity created a powerful contrast with the shortages, queues, and rationing that many ordinary people experienced in communist states during the same period.
The Cold War also accelerated scientific and technological research, because competition with the Soviet Union pushed Western governments to invest in universities, research centers, and private companies, leading to breakthroughs in medicine, computing, aerospace, and communication. And while some of these projects were originally military, many had civilian applications that transformed global society, from satellites and microchips to medical imaging and global telecommunications.
These developments also shaped global trade patterns, because Western industries became dominant in many high-technology sectors, giving capitalist countries an advantage in global markets, while the Soviet Union and its allies often struggled to keep up. And this imbalance reinforced the idea that capitalist economic structures were more dynamic and adaptable, which made Western institutions more attractive to other countries seeking rapid growth and modernization.
By the late stages of the Cold War, it became clear that the Soviet economic model was facing serious problems, with shortages of goods, inefficiencies in production, and little incentive for innovation, while Western economies, despite challenges like oil crises and inflation, proved more resilient. And this difference in economic strength was one of the major factors that led to the Soviet Union's eventual collapse and the triumph of capitalist systems in the global order.
And here is where we begin to see a bridge toward China's story, because unlike the Soviet Union, China did not collapse under the weight of rigid communism, but instead chose to gradually reform its economy, opening up to trade, investment, and market principles while maintaining political control. And this unique path allowed China to benefit from many of the lessons and structures created during the Cold War, while also shaping its own model of growth.
In fact, many of the global trade institutions and economic networks that were strengthened by Western countries during the Cold War later became essential platforms for China's integration into the world economy, especially when China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. And so the Cold War's economic legacy is directly connected to the rise of China, showing how yesterday's competition set the stage for today's shifting balance of power.
So when we study the economic dimensions of the Cold War, we not only learn about the past, but also gain valuable insight into the present. Because the same questions about how to balance state control with market freedom, how to use trade for influence, and how to invest in technology remain central issues today. And for English learners, exploring this history helps improve vocabulary related to economics while also deepening understanding of global development. When we look at the Cold War from the perspective of China, the story takes on a unique character. Because unlike Europe or North America, China was not a superpower in the early stages of this struggle. Yet, it still played a critical role in shaping the balance of global politics, and its choices during this period helped prepare the ground for its later rise to become one of the most influential nations in the 21st century.
At the end of World War II, China was exhausted, devastated by years of conflict with Japan, and divided by a brutal civil war between the nationalists and the communists. And when Mao Zedong and the Communist Party emerged victorious in 1949, establishing the People's Republic of China, they quickly aligned themselves with the Soviet Union, because both nations shared a communist ideology and hoped to resist Western influence in Asia.
This early partnership with the Soviet Union was symbolized by agreements on economic aid, military assistance, and political cooperation. And for a time, China received support in the form of industrial equipment, technical advisors, and training, which helped the new communist state strengthen its foundations. But beneath the surface, there were already tensions between the two countries, since China wanted independence in decision-making, while Moscow expected loyalty and obedience.
By the late 1950s and early 1960s, these tensions exploded into what historians call the Sino-Soviet split, a dramatic break between the two largest communist powers, and this event reshaped the Cold War map, because suddenly China was no longer simply a follower of Soviet policy, but instead became a separate force with its own ambitions, often competing with Moscow for influence in Asia, Africa, and the developing world.
One of the main reasons for the split was ideological disagreement, because while the Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev sought to ease tensions with the West through negotiation and arms control, Mao criticized this approach as weakness, arguing that true communists should resist compromise, and he feared that Soviet policies betrayed revolutionary principles, creating deep mistrust and eventually leading to open hostility between the two former partners.
This hostility even reached the point of border clashes in the late 1960s, showing that Cold War rivalries were not only between the capitalist West and the communist East, but also within the communist camp itself. And for the United States and its allies, this division was a significant strategic opportunity, because it meant the communist world was no longer united, giving Washington new ways to maneuver in its global competition with Moscow.
During this period, China also experienced internal upheavals such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which aimed to transform society rapidly but often caused economic disaster, famine, and social chaos, leaving China weaker compared to both the West and the Soviet Union. And yet, despite these difficulties, the leadership in Beijing remained determined to follow an independent path, resisting domination by any outside power.
The turning point came in the 1970s when China began cautiously opening a channel of communication with the United States, symbolized by President Richard Nixon's historic visit to Beijing in 1972. And this was a groundbreaking moment in Cold War diplomacy, because it showed that even deeply divided nations could find common ground when facing larger threats. In this case, both China and the US saw the Soviet Union as a dangerous rival.
This rapprochement between Washington and Beijing did not make China a Western ally in the traditional sense, but it did create a triangular balance of power where the United States, the Soviet Union, and China each had to calculate their moves more carefully. And for China, this opening to the West provided opportunities for trade, limited technology transfer, and recognition in global institutions like the United Nations, where it gained a permanent seat on the Security Council.
Still, throughout the Cold War, China remained less developed economically than either of the superpowers, and its industrial base lagged far behind. But its population size and geographic position gave it enormous potential. And even though the government remained cautious about reforms until the late 1970s, the seeds of future growth were already being planted as China observed how global systems of trade and development functioned beyond its borders.
The leadership of Deng Xiaoping after 1978 marked the beginning of a new phase because he introduced policies of reform and opening up, which allowed market mechanisms, foreign investment, and more flexible trade, while still keeping the Communist Party firmly in power. And this combination was unique because it meant that China could benefit from many of the capitalist world's economic practices without abandoning its socialist political system.
So in the context of the Cold War, China's position shifted from being a junior partner of the Soviet Union to an independent and sometimes hostile rival of Moscow, to a cautious collaborator with the United States when it suited its interests. And this flexibility allowed China to maintain its sovereignty, avoid being trapped in the shadow of either superpower, and gradually prepare for the moment when it would emerge as a force of its own in global affairs.
And from an educational perspective, this story is important for English learners because it shows how history is not always simple or binary. Since China was neither fully aligned with the Soviet Union nor fully aligned with the West, but instead navigated a complex and shifting landscape, which is a reminder that in international relations, countries often pursue their own interests in ways that do not fit neatly into one side or the other.
When we connect this Cold War experience to the present, we can see how it influenced China's modern rise, because the lessons of independence, cautious diplomacy, and selective cooperation remain central to China's foreign policy today, and by studying these developments, we not only understand history better, but also recognize why China approaches global issues differently than other nations that were once locked more firmly into one Cold War camp.
So as we move forward, we will explore how the Western alliance of the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada responded to these Cold War challenges. Because understanding China's position during this time helps us see why the Western powers developed certain strategies, and it also sets the stage for analyzing how those strategies evolved when China began its dramatic rise in the decades after the Cold War ended.
When we talk about the Cold War, one of the strongest bonds that shaped global politics was the Western alliance, especially the cooperation between the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. These three nations, while different in size and power, worked together under NATO to create a shield against the Soviet Union. The alliance was not only about military strength, but also about shared values like democracy, open trade, and international security.
That's absolutely right, Adam. The United States, because of its size, economic strength, and global reach, naturally became the leading force within NATO. It carried the largest share of military responsibilities, including nuclear deterrence, which was the backbone of Western defense. At the same time, the UK brought in a special role because it had both European influence and global connections through its Commonwealth ties, allowing the alliance to stretch across continents.
Exactly, Julia. Canada's role is often less talked about, but it was extremely important. Canada positioned itself as a middle power, meaning it was not as strong as the US or the UK, yet it had the ability to mediate, negotiate, and contribute to peacekeeping missions. Canadian forces became known worldwide for their blue helmets under the UN, helping to reduce tensions in places where the US or UK might have been seen as too politically heavy.
Canada's unique diplomacy really added balance to the alliance. During the Cold War, Ottawa played an important role in bridging European concerns with North American strategies. By supporting NATO but also pushing for dialogue, Canada helped prevent situations from escalating too quickly. This made the Western alliance not just about hard power, but also about soft power, where persuasion and negotiation were just as vital as tanks and aircraft.
Now, If we focus on the U.S. leadership, it wasn't only about commanding armies or developing weapons. It was about setting the vision for the Western alliance. Washington promoted the idea that defending freedom in Europe was defending freedom everywhere. This worldview tied together the military, economic, and cultural aspects of NATO, convincing allies that unity was the only way to resist the Soviet Union's influence.
The UK, on the other hand, acted like a bridge between the United States and Europe. While Washington often pushed for strong military readiness, London sometimes emphasized diplomacy with Moscow, especially during moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis. The UK also had a strong intelligence community, working hand in hand with the US through partnerships like the Five Eyes Intelligence Network, where Canada was also a member, making information sharing a central element of the alliance.
Yes, intelligence was a hidden but powerful part of this cooperation. The Cold War was not only fought with weapons, but also with information, knowing what the Soviet Union planned, where their influence was spreading, and how to counter it effectively. The US provided the scale, the UK provided experience and networks, and Canada offered trusted support. Together, they formed a triangle of strength that helped the alliance stay resilient through decades of uncertainty.
Another important point is how these countries used NATO to show unity. NATO wasn't just a military pact, it was also a political symbol. Whenever the US, UK, and Canada spoke together within NATO, it showed the Soviet Union that the West would not easily be divided. This message of unity discouraged Moscow from trying to separate European allies from North America, which could have weakened the alliance.
And we should not forget the sacrifices. The US invested huge amounts of money in maintaining bases across Europe. The UK carried the burden of reconstruction after World War II while still investing in defense, and Canada committed troops far from home in Europe. These actions showed that the alliance was not just talk, it was backed by real contributions, which gave it credibility on the global stage.
All of this set the stage for how the Western alliance would later respond to new challenges. After the Cold War ended, this partnership had to adapt to different threats like terrorism, cyber warfare, and of course, the economic and geopolitical rise of China. The legacy of close cooperation during the Cold War gave the US, UK, and Canada the experience they needed to face a rapidly changing world.
That's a great point. What makes this section of history so relevant today is that the trust built during the Cold War didn't simply vanish in 1991. Instead, it became the foundation for addressing new power shifts. And as China emerged as a major global player, this alliance had to reflect on what unity and strategy would mean in the 21st century.
So when we study the Western alliance in the Cold War, we're not only learning about the past, we're seeing the roots of today's strategic choices. Understanding how the US led, how the UK balanced Europe and the world, and how Canada provided diplomacy helps us see why this partnership continues to matter in shaping global politics today. The Cold War, which had shaped world politics for nearly half a century, came to a dramatic end in 1991. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not a single event, but the result of years of internal weakness, economic stagnation, and political reforms that spiraled out of control. When the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time over the Kremlin, it symbolized not just the end of a state, but the end of an entire system of power that had challenged the West since 1945.
That moment was often described as the triumph of liberal democracy and free market capitalism. For decades, the West had argued that democracy and open economies offered the best future for humanity. The fall of the Soviet Union seemed to prove that claim. Countries across Eastern Europe turned to elections, markets, and integration with Western institutions. The United States and its allies celebrated what looked like the final victory of their model over communism.
Indeed, people at the time believed we had entered a completely new era. There was even talk of the end of history, an idea suggesting that humanity had reached the ultimate system of government and economics. Liberal democracy, open societies, and globalization were seen as the natural destiny for all nations. The optimism of the early 1990s was powerful, and many leaders imagined a world where great power rivalry was over and cooperation would define international relations.
This optimism was visible in how global institutions expanded. NATO transformed from a purely military alliance into a political and security organization that reached into Eastern Europe. The European Union grew, bringing in countries that had once been behind the Iron Curtain. The United Nations, World Trade Organization, and World Bank gained influence, reflecting the hope that international cooperation could prevent future conflicts and promote shared prosperity.
Another legacy of the Cold War's end was the rapid spread of globalization. Trade grew quickly, technology connected societies, and capital flowed across borders at an unprecedented speed. Companies set up global supply chains, students studied abroad, and governments opened their economies to international markets. The spirit of the 1990s was one of openness, with the belief that global integration would make wars less likely because countries would be too economically connected to fight.
However, this new era also raised important questions. While the Soviet Union had disappeared, other nations began to rise in influence. Among them was China, which had already been experimenting with economic reforms under Deng Xiaoping since the late 1970s. With the Cold War over, China was now positioned to take advantage of globalization and carve out a new role in world affairs. The question was not whether China would grow, but how the rest of the world would respond to its rise.
China's path was very different from the Soviet Union's. Instead of collapsing under the weight of its system, China reformed its economy while maintaining political control under the Communist Party. As the West celebrated the end of communism in Europe, few realized that a new and unique model was forming in Asia, one that combined market reforms with one-party rule. This model would soon test the assumptions of the post-Cold War optimism.
But at that moment in 1991, the mood was still full of confidence. The United States stood as the sole superpower, sometimes called the unipolar moment. Its influence stretched across military, economic, cultural, and technological fields. The UK and Canada, along with other allies, believed they were entering a safer, more predictable world. NATO even looked for new missions, as its original purpose, containing the Soviet Union, seemed completed.
Yet history rarely stands still. While the West was focused on celebrating its victory, new challenges slowly emerged. Globalization created winners, but it also created inequalities and tensions. Some countries benefited greatly, while others struggled. For many in the West, manufacturing jobs disappeared, replaced by service industries or outsourced labor. These economic shifts later fueled political debates and doubts about whether globalization truly worked for everyone.
And this brings us back to China. As globalization accelerated, China integrated itself into the world economy, joining organizations like the World Trade Organization in 2001. This integration allowed China to use the very system that the West had built after the Cold War to its own advantage. While the early 1990s were about Western triumph, the following decades would increasingly be about how China fit or challenged that vision of a globalized world.
So the end of the Cold War was both a conclusion and a beginning. It marked the end of one great rivalry, but it also laid the foundation for the rise of new power dynamics. The optimism of 1991 told us that liberal democracy and globalization were universal answers. But as the years passed, the world discovered that the story was far more complex, especially when considering China's growing role on the global stage.
Exactly. That's why studying the end of the Cold War is so important. It helps us understand not only how the Soviet Union collapsed, but also how the international system shifted afterward. To see where we are today, debating the rise of China, the role of Western alliances, and the future of globalization, we need to reflect on this turning point in history. It reminds us that every ending is also the start of a new chapter. When the Cold War ended, the world turned its eyes toward a new story: China's rise. Unlike the Soviet Union, which collapsed under economic pressure, China had been quietly reforming since the late 1970s under Deng Xiaoping. His famous phrase, "It doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice," symbolized a shift from strict communist planning to pragmatic economic growth. By the 1990s, China was opening its markets and experimenting with global trade.
That's a crucial point, Adam. China didn't copy the Soviet model, and it didn't follow the Western one entirely either. Instead, it created its own path. Farmers were allowed to sell their crops, factories could experiment with production for profit, and foreign companies were invited to invest. These reforms created special economic zones, where international businesses could operate with fewer restrictions. This strategy gave China a testing ground for capitalism without abandoning its political system.
The results were extraordinary. China's economy began to grow at double-digit rates, lifting millions of people out of poverty. Cities like Shenzhen transformed from small fishing villages into global megacities filled with skyscrapers, factories, and bustling markets. For the first time in centuries, China was not just a large country. It was becoming an economic powerhouse with the ability to reshape global trade patterns.
A turning point came in 2001 when China officially joined the World Trade Organization. This was like being admitted into the world's biggest economic club. Membership meant that China had to follow international rules for trade, but it also meant that the rest of the world opened its doors to Chinese exports. Factories in China produced clothes, electronics, and toys at a scale and cost that no other country could match. Soon the phrase "made in China" became part of everyday life worldwide.
This is why many people called China the world's factory. Its huge labor force, lower wages, and improving infrastructure made it the perfect hub for global manufacturing. Western companies saw China as a place to reduce costs and expand markets. By outsourcing production to China, they gained profits, while China gained jobs, skills, and technology. This partnership fueled China's rapid growth and tied its economy deeply into the global system.
But this rise wasn't only about economics. It also carried major geopolitical consequences. During the Cold War, the world had been divided into two camps, capitalist and communist. After 1991, it seemed that capitalism had won. Yet, China's models showed a different possibility: a one-party state using market reforms to achieve prosperity while keeping tight political control. This combination challenged the assumption that democracy was the only path to development.
That's an excellent observation. Many Western thinkers believed that as China integrated into global trade, it would gradually become more open politically. But instead, China's leaders embraced globalization on their own terms. They welcomed investment and trade, but they kept a firm grip on political power. This created a unique situation where China benefited from the global system without fully adopting Western political values.
It's also important to remember the human side of this story. For ordinary Chinese citizens, the reforms meant opportunities their parents never imagined. Millions moved from rural villages to booming cities, where factories and companies needed workers. Education improved, technology spread, and living standards rose dramatically. At the same time, these changes brought challenges such as pollution, income inequality, and rapid urbanization. Growth was powerful, but it came at a cost.
From the perspective of the United States, the UK, and Canada, China's rise was at first seen as a positive development. Many leaders believed that a richer China would be a more responsible international partner. They thought that economic interdependence would reduce the risk of conflict. In fact, in the 1990s and early 2000s, Western governments encouraged trade with China, seeing it as part of the global economic engine.
Yes, but as time passed, the sheer scale of China's growth started to change the balance of power. Factories that once operated in North America or Europe closed and moved to Asia. While consumers enjoyed cheaper goods, many workers in Western countries lost jobs. This created political debates about globalization, with some praising it for lifting people out of poverty worldwide, while others criticized it for weakening domestic industries.
That dynamic is what makes the post-Cold War world so complex. During the Cold War, the lines were clear. One side was capitalist, the other communist. After the Cold War, China blurred those lines by mixing elements of both. This made China's rise more challenging for the West to interpret. Was China a partner in globalization, or was it a competitor preparing to reshape the international order?
And this question remains central today. The legacy of China's rise after the Cold War is that it transformed not only itself, but also the entire global system. Trade routes shifted, industries relocated, and global politics became multipolar instead of unipolar. The West had to rethink its strategies because China was no longer a quiet participant. It was an active shaper of global realities.
So when we look back, China's economic reforms, its entry into the WTO, and its role as the world's factory were not just economic events. They were milestones in a broader transformation that redefined global power. Just as the Cold War shaped the second half of the 20th century, China's rise has been shaping the 21st century, forcing the world to reconsider old assumptions about growth, power, and cooperation.
Exactly. To understand today's debates about trade wars, technology competition, and global influence, we must trace them back to this period after the Cold War. That's when China began to stand up, not as an isolated state, but as a country deeply tied to globalization and yet determined to follow its own path. This makes China's story one of the most important legacies of the post-Cold War world. As China emerged as a global economic power, the United States had to reconsider its role in the world. The approach became multifaceted, combining competition, cooperation, and tension. On one hand, the US saw opportunities for trade, investment, and technology exchange, encouraging businesses to engage with China. On the other hand, concerns about intellectual property, strategic influence, and human rights made clear that competition and vigilance were necessary in certain areas to protect national interests.
The United Kingdom faced similar complexities, although its strategy had distinct characteristics. London emphasized economic partnerships, promoting trade and investment opportunities for British companies in China, while carefully monitoring potential risks to its security and global influence. The UK also considered its historical ties to Asia and its role in European and global institutions, meaning that engagement with China required balancing economic interests with diplomatic responsibilities to allies and international norms.
Canada, as a middle power, approached China with careful consideration, seeking to benefit from trade while also maintaining its commitment to political values and human rights. Ottawa encouraged Canadian businesses to expand into Chinese markets, but simultaneously engaged in diplomacy that promoted global norms, peacekeeping, and multilateral cooperation. This balancing act reflected Canada's unique position, a country economically connected to the world, yet determined to preserve ethical principles in foreign policy.
One key factor shaping Western responses was the Cold War experience. The US, UK, and Canada had decades of managing strategic threats and alliances, learning how to combine hard power with diplomacy. This experience informed decisions about China, for example, promoting trade and engagement without abandoning military readiness, intelligence sharing, and alliance cohesion. Lessons from NATO cooperation and Cold War crises helped the West manage China's rise strategically while avoiding outright confrontation.
The United States, in particular, focused on a strategy of selective engagement. Washington encouraged Chinese participation in global institutions, welcomed Chinese investment in technology, and infrastructure, and sought cooperation on global issues like climate change, while simultaneously reinforcing alliances in the Indo-Pacific region. Military exercises, naval presence, and defense partnerships with countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia became part of a broader approach to manage both opportunities and risks in relation to China's growing power.
The United Kingdom, while smaller than the US, leveraged its global networks to advance strategic interests. London promoted trade in areas like finance, manufacturing, and technology, but also remained alert to challenges posed by China's influence in sensitive sectors. Intelligence cooperation with the US and other partners helped Britain identify potential security threats, while diplomatic channels maintained open communication with Beijing, showing that strategy relied on a careful balance between economic opportunity and geopolitical caution.
Canada's role was particularly interesting because it often acted as a mediator or bridge between approaches. Ottawa could benefit economically from Chinese markets while using its reputation for ethical diplomacy to encourage dialogue and multilateral solutions. For example, Canada participated in trade agreements, supported international rules for investment and intellectual property, and encouraged China to participate in global problem-solving initiatives. This approach reflected Canada's Cold War experience in promoting cooperation and stability without sacrificing core values.
All three countries also recognized that China's rise could not be addressed in isolation. Just as during the Cold War, alliances and partnerships were critical. By coordinating strategies, sharing intelligence, and aligning economic policies, the Western powers sought to ensure that engagement with China supported long-term stability. The lessons of history were clear. Unilateral action risked failure, while collaboration allowed the US, UK, and Canada to respond to global shifts more effectively.
Another dimension of Western strategy was technological competition. The US, UK, and Canada monitored China's advancements in artificial intelligence, telecommunications, and infrastructure development, understanding that economic growth was tightly linked to technological leadership. While engaging with Chinese companies and markets, Western nations also implemented measures to protect sensitive technology and prevent strategic dominance in areas critical to security and economic resilience.
This combination of cooperation, competition, and vigilance created a nuanced policy framework. The Cold War had taught the West that strength alone was insufficient. Alliances, economic integration, intelligence networks, and strategic planning were equally important. By applying these lessons to China's rise, the US, UK, and Canada created a model that sought to maximize benefits while minimizing risks, ensuring that their approach remained flexible as China continued to grow in influence and capability.
In conclusion, Western responses to China's rise were deeply influenced by decades of Cold War experience. Policies were carefully calibrated to encourage trade and cooperation while managing strategic competition and safeguarding national interests. This balancing act continues to evolve, highlighting how history shapes present decisions and reminding us that engagement with a rising power requires wisdom, patience, and coordination across multiple dimensions of global strategy.
So, when we reflect on this period, it's clear that the West's approach to China is not simply reactive. It's the result of decades of experience, lessons learned from previous global conflicts, and the understanding that economic growth, technological competition, and strategic alliances must be managed together. This complex approach underscores the lasting legacy of the Cold War in shaping the modern world. Looking back at the Cold War, one of the clearest lessons is that strategic patience matters. The US, UK, and Canada learned that global competition isn't resolved overnight, and that alliances, careful diplomacy, and long-term planning are often more effective than immediate confrontation. The Cold War showed that balancing deterrence with engagement, preparing for multiple scenarios, and understanding the motivations of other states are critical skills for navigating international relations.
History also teaches us the value of understanding a rival's perspective. The West sometimes underestimated China during the early post-Cold War period, assuming that engagement alone would naturally align China's policies with Western values. But, like the Cold War with the Soviet Union, misreading intentions can lead to surprises. Careful analysis, cultural understanding, and historical awareness are crucial for anticipating how China may act in global affairs while protecting the interests of the US, UK, and Canada.
Yes, and lessons from the Cold War show that flexibility is critical. Rigid strategies often fail when global conditions shift unexpectedly. The US, UK, and Canada adapted their approaches over decades to respond to crises, technological advances, and changing alliances. In dealing with China, flexibility remains essential, whether adjusting trade policies, forming multilateral partnerships, or responding to security challenges. Learning from past successes and mistakes helps avoid repeating errors in the modern era.
Another important aspect is managing competition without escalating into conflict. During the Cold War, both sides avoided direct confrontation in Europe and Asia, using proxy strategies and negotiations instead. This allowed them to compete fiercely while preventing full-scale war. Today, competition with China, whether in technology, trade, or influence, is intense. But the Cold War experience reminds us that careful management of tensions, rather than impulsive escalation, can protect global stability and prevent unnecessary crises.
Trust and verification were also key lessons. Treaties like arms reduction agreements required transparency, inspections, and monitoring. This combination of trust, backed by accountability measures, kept competition within manageable limits. When engaging with China, transparency in trade practices, technology standards, and military activities is similarly vital. Building mechanisms for accountability ensures that relationships remain stable even amid rivalry, just as verification helped the West and the Soviet Union avoid misunderstandings.
Education and awareness are another lesson. During the Cold War, public understanding of global issues, media reporting, and expert analysis played a role in shaping policies. Citizens, leaders, and institutions needed accurate information to make decisions. Today, understanding China's rise also requires education, research, and informed discussion. Misperceptions can lead to overreaction or complacency, whereas historical knowledge helps policymakers balance opportunity with caution.
Ultimately, the Cold War teaches us that history is a guide, not a blueprint. The West cannot simply copy past actions, but can learn patterns, strategies, and pitfalls. Diplomacy, alliances, economic engagement, strategic patience, and clear communication remain relevant tools. The US, UK, and Canada must study the past to inform present choices, ensuring that engagement with China is thoughtful, balanced, and prepared for a dynamic global environment.
So when we reflect on these lessons, it's clear that the Cold War provides more than historical insight. It offers a framework for action. By analyzing what worked, what failed, and how alliances and strategies evolved, the Western powers can navigate China's rise more effectively. Understanding history allows for smarter policies, stronger cooperation, and an approach that balances competition with stability in a rapidly changing world.
And for students and English learners, studying these lessons is doubly valuable. Not only does it improve knowledge of global politics, but it also provides context for language learning through historical analysis, critical thinking, and discussion of international affairs. Comparing Cold War patterns with today's realities helps learners connect past and present, enhancing comprehension and broadening their perspective of the modern world.
Exactly. By studying history and observing how lessons from the Cold War apply to today's challenges, we gain insights into both strategy and diplomacy. we see that managing global power requires intelligence, foresight, and cooperation. The Cold War's legacy is alive in the way the US, UK, and Canada engage with China, reminding us that history is not only about the past, it actively shapes the present and future of international relations. As we reach the end of our discussion, it's clear that the Cold War left a profound legacy that continues to shape the global order today. The alliances formed between the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada created a framework for cooperation, security, and shared values that persists in modern diplomacy. Understanding these relationships helps explain how the Western powers respond strategically to today's challenges, especially the rise of China as an influential global actor.
Absolutely, Adam. One of the most important takeaways is that history provides lessons in balance. During the Cold War, the West learned to combine military strength, diplomatic engagement, and economic influence to achieve stability without triggering large-scale conflict. Today, that same balance is crucial when engaging with China. Cooperation in trade and global issues must be paired with strategic competition where interests and security are at stake.
Reflecting on China's rise, we can see both parallels and contrasts with the Cold War era. Just as the US, UK, and Canada coordinated their policies to manage the Soviet challenge, they now rely on alliances and partnerships to navigate China's growing influence. Yet the tools have changed. Economic integration, technological competition, and global governance structures are more prominent now. The underlying principle remains the same. Strategy, collaboration, and foresight are essential.
Another key insight is the role of diplomacy. The Cold War was not only about armies and weapons, it was about negotiations, intelligence, and dialogue. Similarly, today's world requires thoughtful engagement with China, combining trade agreements, multilateral forums, and careful negotiation to manage conflicts and promote global stability. History reminds us that understanding the motives, culture, and strategies of other nations is vital for effective international relations.
The Cold War also highlighted the importance of alliances, which continue to shape world politics. NATO, partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, and transatlantic cooperation demonstrate that countries working together can amplify influence, manage risks, and address shared challenges. These lessons are directly applicable to today's interactions with China, showing how coordination between like-minded nations can balance competition with collaboration for mutual benefit.
And we shouldn't overlook economic lessons. During the Cold War, programs like the Marshall Plan strengthened partners while promoting shared values. Today, global trade, investment, and technology exchanges require similar foresight. Engaging with China economically while maintaining ethical and strategic considerations reflects the same combination of opportunity and caution that guided Western powers in the past.
From a strategic perspective, the Cold War taught patience, adaptability, and long-term planning. Immediate reactions often fail, but careful, measured approaches allow nations to maintain influence and stability. This principle applies to current global challenges, particularly in managing relationships with a rising power like China. Policymakers today draw on decades of historical experience to make decisions that balance risk and reward in a complex international system.
For English learners and students, reflecting on these lessons is especially valuable. Studying history, diplomacy, and global affairs improves critical thinking, comprehension, and language skills. It allows learners to see patterns in world events, understand cause and effect, and connect past conflicts to present realities. This holistic approach strengthens both intellectual understanding and language proficiency.
In summary, the Cold War's legacy is alive in today's world. Alliances, diplomacy, economic strategy, and balanced engagement remain essential tools. The rise of China challenges the international order, but it also demonstrates how history can guide present and future decisions. By studying these lessons, we gain perspective on global affairs and understand the enduring importance of collaboration, foresight, and strategy.
Finally, we encourage all our listeners to keep exploring history. Understanding events like the Cold War and the rise of China not only deepens knowledge of global affairs, but also strengthens reasoning, critical thinking, and English skills. History is more than dates and facts. It's a map for navigating today's world, offering insight, perspective, and inspiration for learners who want to understand the forces shaping our future.
Exactly. Every global challenge, every strategic decision has roots in the past. By learning from those experiences, we can approach today's complex world with clarity, confidence, and curiosity. For English learners, this approach doubles as both a language lesson and a way to engage meaningfully with the world, connecting language study with real-life global understanding.
So keep reading, exploring, and asking questions. Every historical lesson, every discussion about global affairs helps you build knowledge, improve language skills, and develop a broader perspective. The Cold War may have ended decades ago, but its lessons continue to guide the world. And by studying them, you gain the tools to understand the present and think critically about the future.